I think an interesting question is AI creative? Or is it all because it's completely derivative from other people's work, which is like, basically stealing other people's work? Is it therefore not capable of creativity ever? But are we then, as humans, are we creative? Because we are inspired by other people's work. Is that a different process? Now, my argument is that it is different for us because at some point we came up with something from absolutely nothing, whereas AI, a machine, has never done that because it always came from something that has come before, whereas a human being has been able to create everything that we have today. And at some point we had nothing, which means that a human being is capable of complete creativity, whereas a machine is not.
This is an interesting one because, I don't think it's intuitive. I don't think if I were an AI and I could still somehow have my human perspective on things, I would consider myself creative. However, if art is subjective, and it is, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it is, if AI comes up with things that humans generally find creative, quote unquote, having creativity, then, it's it's a tough thing about like, where does like the arrow of language point, right? Like, AI can, AI can produce things that are creative, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's conscious at all, right? This shit started with a better point than it's ending. I'm sorry. Nice to meet you, Catherine.
Hey, this is a link to another chat by Brett Hull, where he is discussing a tweet that Sam Altman made talking about creativity, where he implied that there is no such thing as creativity and AI is creative. And Brett very eloquently argues against it and identifies great examples of human ingenuity and creativity that validate counter-argument, and that human creativity is capable of, humans are capable of far greater creativity than AI. I think it raises interesting questions because there are different types of creativity, and some creativity is more impressive than others. And for the most part, one could argue that a lot of what is classed as creativity is in fact what Altman is referring to, where it's small iterations of things that have already been done. That is not to say that humans are not capable of much greater levels of creativity. And if there's a bell curve, the Einsteins of this world, the Newtons, the Da Vincis, or any other great artists or scientists demonstrating amazing creativity, they're outliers. And that's not where the bulk of creativity is. So I can see why some people do say that AI is creative, because it is effectively capable of replicating the process of creativity that a lot of people pass off for creativity these days. But I agree with Brett that AI is not capable of achieving the levels of creativity that humans are.
I think at its root, being creative is to create. And so if you create something, you're therefore creative. And by those terms, AI is therefore creative. And I think art overall has achieved this same definition, where modern artists have pushed the boundaries of what is considered to be art, as being anything someone creates could be considered art. And so they've done things like just putting, a toilet in the middle of the museum and saying, this is art because someone created it. Now, there was a time when art was considered objectively beautiful, where if you did not consider it beautiful, then that meant there was something lacking in you and not in the art. And so I think there's better arguments for this idea of art being something that is objectively beautiful. And can AI create art?
AI is a model of the human brain. It's something people have created. I think it's still limited to mimicry, the process, rules we give it. I don't think it would ever have a conscience, emotions, or empathy in the pure human sense. But AI output is still somewhat capped in comparison to humans, where our capacity and output is unlimited within our respective timeline. And much of what humans have created have also largely been inspired by other humans, nature, biology. And we're constantly building on what's already been discovered. To be fair, it's also part trial and error, part luck, and a whole lot of persistence and optimism. And if we look back in history, there are these outliers, and it's mainly because they didn't conform to consensus, and they were persistent in what they were working on. There was a documentary on this Go game, AlphaGo. There was a 37th move that was unexpected. That made me question a bit. Was it being creative? Was it an intuitive move? Or was it just a computer bug? Because in 97, with IBM's Deep Blue, the chess game, they found and concluded that unexpected move on the rook was a computer bug. I think there's still a lot that we don't understand about the human brain, and it's still a product of a million years of evolution after all. But there's clear differences between AI and the human brain. I think that the way in which we have our levels of output is almost practically unlimited, but the way that AI outputs information for the time being, it's subject to what it can learn based on the iterations. But either way, I think that it's just limited by a language. The way human beings absorb information, we're not just looking from one language to another. These observations are sensories. Well, when it comes to these AI programs, it's limited in the models that we give it, as well as the language and how we explain something to it. But what about things that can't be programmed? How are we able to learn those concepts and ideas? But for now, I think human will prevail.
My view of creativity follows that of David Deutsch, as expressed in the beginning of Infinity, where he basically says that what it means for something to have been created is that it had no antecedents in the world. Something genuinely new is brought into the world. It's not merely a mashup, but rather it wasn't there in any form prior to it being created. Otherwise, it doesn't deserve to be called a creation. There are therefore two kinds of creativity, and they are both, not coincidentally, the two kinds of knowledge that you can have in the world. The first is the creativity of evolution by natural selection, as explained by Darwin. This is a way of bringing into existence organisms that were not there in any form prior to them being created. I've made this point before here on AirChat. It's not like kangaroos were there in some form prior to their evolution. They evolved And although there might have been something similar, the kangaroo itself, red kangaroo, grey kangaroo, and call it what you want, that species did not exist prior to evolution by natural selection creating it. The other kind of creativity is what people uniquely do, creating explanations, new forms of accounts about the world. These can be both factual and fictional. Factual as in an account of physical reality in some way, shape or form. That's all of our sciences, that's history, that's mathematics, and so on and so forth. Or the fictional, the worlds of Harry Potter and J.R.R. Tolkien and George Lucas, and name your fictional world or story, a piece of music, let's say. All of these things are creativity of a different kind to what evolution by natural selection is, because they are accounts, explanations of the world, factual or fictional. So why doesn't AI, as it currently exists, count as being something that is creative? Because it's an extrapolation engine. What it does is draw from a vast library and mash up that library in order to produce something that is there in the library. It seems to be new because it's a recombination of things that are already there, but it's not inherently new. This is completely unlike what evolution by natural selection does and what explanatory creativity by people is. When I say it's an extrapolation engine, we can look at that from a number of angles. The first is that, as I say, you're not getting anything genuinely new. So you ask it to, let's say, write a poem about anything at all, the standard model of particle physics, and it will do a reasonable job of that. But it's drawing on what it understands poetry to be in its library. It's not going to invent a new form of poetry. It's just going to rely upon the existing rhythms, the existing ways that people have already come up with for what counts as poetry. Human beings, however, invent new styles of poetry.
AI is good at pulling up answers like Google search, but it's bad at combining ideas to create a new one. And to give you an example of the latter, I recommend Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State, which is packed full of sort of syncretic insights that can only arise when you combine two different ideas into a new one. AI just regurgitates, and the human mind is capable of creating. And I think AI is not creative, but perhaps AGI will be creative.
So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, what people do when they create knowledge is not rely upon the entire corpus of all knowledge that has ever been discovered before in order to generate something new, but in fact, from when they are first born, babies and infants, they rely upon scant amounts of knowledge, small traces of hints they get about the world from their senses, from what other people are telling them, and from there, they are able to make huge leaps of the imagination and construct their own reality in their minds. And they have a consciousness, an awakening, an ability to see in their mind's eye the rest of the world. Again, they construct this entire world from scant amounts of evidence in the form of what they hear through their ears, what they see with their eyes, what they feel with their hands, and so on it goes. They construct this world from this tiny, tiny amount of evidence. Contrast this with what ChatGPT does. A vast library, the greatest library of information that has ever been assembled by human beings. That's loaded, preloaded into the engine, which is then iterating on that information. It's not constructing anything new, but as I say, it's reassembling, recombining, not reimagining, doesn't have an imagination, but merely calculating and extrapolating. So we must distinguish between extrapolation and creation. Extrapolation is, here's this vast library, and you're going to find patterns in that library and effectively draw graphs based upon the data you already have and extrapolate a straight line or a curve, whatever it happens to be. And in the case of ChatGPT, extrapolate a language model. This is to be compared with creativity, where you're not doing anything of the sort. You're not relying upon vast amounts of past data, but rather you're inventing out of whole cloth an idea which you are then testing against reality. You're testing it against your senses. This is what babies do. This is what infants do. This is what all human beings do and what all people will do. The idea comes from within, not built upon a whole bunch of data, but rather coming from inside via a process we do not understand, which is then tested against the evidence. A completely different picture of how these two things happen. Extrapolation on the one hand, creativity on the other. So is AI creative? No, not yet. We will know when it is because it will be able to explain to us something completely new. Importantly, it will be able to disobey. It will do something other than what you expect. ChatGPT won't just be chatting with you. Suddenly, the screen will go blank, and instead of it responding with language, it'll start flashing with lights. Something like that. It'll do something not in its programming. It will disobey. We're nowhere near that right now. We can't even imagine what kind of algorithm that would be, because every form of code we have is an explicit instruction to do a task, to complete a task. It would be a bizarre thing if the program disobeyed what the coder had in mind. We don't know how to begin to construct an algorithm that would disobey. And also, to add to this idea of disobedience as being linked to creativity, we can add to this the idea of having a problem. We human beings have problems. All day, every day, what we do is we wake up in the morning and we have the problem. I have the problem of, I'm hungry, I feel like a coffee, might have a cup of tea. How do I get it? What do I do next? The kid's woken up. What do I do about that? How do I get to work? What kind of transport am I going to get? So the list is infinite of problems that you have. You have them. They are generated in your mind. AI doesn't have problems. You give it a task to do. You have the problem. You want to find out something from ChatGPT, and then you ask it. It doesn't have the problem. It has no problems. It's not sitting there on its own thinking and ruminating. It will just begin to calculate once you've typed something in. There's no creativity going on there. It's calculating. It is doing little more than what a pocket calculator does in terms of arithmetic. It is calculating language. That's the only difference between these two things. There's nothing substantively different between a pocket calculator and ChatGPT. One uses numbers, one uses language. Creativity, disobedience, the capacity to have a problem. And I would say that the capacity to have a problem, the capacity to disobey, to encounter something that you're expected to do and have this feeling of not wanting to conform. These things are intimately linked, I would suggest, to consciousness. This is why I say consciousness and creativity may indeed be the same thing looked at from two different angles, from the inside and from the outside. Because having a problem, this capacity to feel as if you're not satisfied for the moment and you will need to solve this particular problem. That capacity rests upon a subjective experience of the world. You're experiencing something, you're sensing something, you're feeling something is not quite satisfactory. This is why the Buddhists quite rightly have this notion of unsatisfactoriness. That's what's going on in life. You're having a problem now, in this moment, and you feel you have to do something about it. Viewed from the outside, other people appear to be solving their problems when we say, those entities, other people, other human beings, the people around us, they're creative. Look at them creating stuff, coming up with new ideas all the time. And I don't just mean, people doing grand art and new theories of physics. I mean, just walking down the street and figuring out how to get around a puddle, how to deal with a child that's running around and then trying to ensure they don't run into the traffic. All of this kind of problem-solving stuff is creativity. Creativity in action every moment. It's not calculation. It's conjecturing. It's guessing about possible futures, coming up with solutions, quickly refuting them in your mind and acting on one or the other. You're not calculating. You're guessing and you're checking. These are different things. And the reason why they're different things is that, once more, one, the calculation rests upon a vast amount of information that has been encoded somewhere or other. In the case of the pocket calculator, the axioms of arithmetic. In the case of ChatGPT, a vast library of basically everything that all human beings know, aggregated together and then averaged in some way so that it spits out an expected response, the average response that people would give if they had access to all the information in the world. Nothing new, nothing unexpected, so to speak, except, unexpected in the sense that, wow, a machine can do this. Unexpected for a while, but now we're all used to it. We would hope. But we're not calculating. We're not relying upon a vast library, as I've already said. Instead, you're not consulting all of your background knowledge. At any moment when you need to solve a problem, you invent on the spot a theory. Either it works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then you quickly invent another one. You're not consulting this huge library of information you have. So sure, sometimes your background knowledge is relevant, yes, but that is a scant amount of information compared to what ChatGPT has access to. What you're doing is of black and white difference to that. You're inventing an idea. You're creating something new, unlike ChatGPT, which is just mashing stuff up. And because it's this vast library that any single human being just isn't aware of, the overwhelming majority of human knowledge that's out there, because it's mashing this stuff up, it appears to any single individual human being that sometimes it's astonishing in what it comes up with, and it gives the illusion of creativity. If you're trained in the sciences and mathematics and stuff like me, then you'll be overly impressed, as I am, with ChatGPT's capacity to invent poetry and do something like write a Seinfeld script, because that's not my business. That's not what I do all the time. And so I look at that and I go, that's impressive. On the other hand, if you are actually a writer or a poet or a scriptwriter, you look at what ChatGPT puts out and you go, that's rubbish. That's hopeless. That's so derivative. There's nothing creative there. And on the other hand, the scriptwriter, the person who's trained in English and linguistics and so on, when presented with ChatGPT coming up with a scientific explanation of something, is impressed. But on the other hand, people like me, trained in the sciences, when presented with an explanation given by ChatGPT of some sort of scientific thing, is completely unimpressed. I'm unimpressed when I'm told, by ChatGPT how to understand quantum theory, how to understand anything in science. You just think that's a terribly derivative, boring, uncreative thing you would expect from an undergraduate who's read a textbook on this stuff. There's nothing new there. So this is why the illusion of creativity is there, because for any one person, we don't have the kind of access to all the information that ChatGPT does. So sometimes in some domains, it can impress some of us some of the time, but no one will be impressed all of the time. And so this is once again the difference, that ChatGPT can pull the wool over the eyes of people because no one is competent at everything. ChatGPT kind of does have competence at everything except for the one thing that all people do have competence in, which is creativity. It's competent at mathematics, it's competent at writing poetry, it's competent at translation, all this sort of stuff. It's competent in coding. But competency is quite different to innovation and creativity. If you're an employer, you probably want a creative person, not merely a competent one. AI is very, very good, and will be for a while, at being perfectly competent at doing things. And that's great. We should automate those things where we just want competency. But if you want something new, if you want something creative, you better have a person there that isn't merely competent, but goes well beyond that.
I think the AI is as creative as the algorithm makes it be, and I think it's basically impossible to say that it's not creative or is creative. That's based on our understanding of creativity and intelligence as we have it now. And I'm using your definition of creativity in the sense that it has no antecedents. I'm not sure you can really say that it can't come up with things that don't have antecedents. I think you can trivially make it come up with things that don't have antecedents. Try asking it to invent a new form of poetry. It can do a pretty good job of that. I think a better definition of creativity might be a solution that solves a problem. Maybe I've got a hammer and everything looks like a nail, but I think that is probably more useful than saying creativity is something that doesn't have antecedents. I also think its algorithm and whether it's doing a mashup or extrapolation are irrelevant. What's going on inside is not relevant, only the result is relevant.
Let me try to put this another way then. There is something different that people do compared to existing AI like chatbots and so on and so forth. So we could call it whatever you like. So following Popper, there's no need to quibble about, what does the word creative mean? But we do need to be able to distinguish between this thing that people do and this thing that things like ChatGPT do.